Hello, everyone. Okay, so this week we're doing the West, and this is the last subject we have until we do test one. Um, do we have um, do we have any questions before we begin? Any questions from anyone? All right. So please remember you have a textbook quiz that I'd like you to do by Sunday evening. The first two or three quizzes I'm going to go ahead and put in that you could put in multiple submissions so you could take them over to get a better score if need be. But I probably won't continue that after the first few, okay? Just kind of academic integrity. I want you to be able to earn it thereafter, but just get kind of a gist of the type of questions I ask. I hope that you guys have been looking at test one and preparing for it, as you'll have next week to do that, as well as another textbook quiz. So next week, you just have test one and the next textbook quiz to do throughout the week. There will be no argumentative assignment next week. Okay. So jumping into this with the West, right? What I try to do is I try to make it argumentative. Remember to make it a little less boring for those of you who are taking this class and are not interested in history, and also make it more useful. And that no matter what your major is, critical thinking is never anything that is irrelevant to what you're going to do in life, in my opinion. So at any rate, with number one, you're looking at Turner's thesis, right? A guy named Frederick Jackson Turner in 1893. 1892, he started it, the 400th anniversary of Columbus coming to America. And so he was in a very patriotic mood in this intellectual atmosphere. And he tried to bring forth somewhat of a patriotic thesis, as he stated that America, right? America or Americana, what America represents is equality of opportunity. That no matter what background you're from, ethnically, socioeconomically, your family's last name, regionally, place of origin, that it doesn't matter, that America is all about having equal opportunities to rise up the socioeconomic pyramid or achieve what we call the American dream, right? Well, he states that in the East, it wasn't always that way. When you go back to your History 101, you find evidence of certain demographics kind of taking the best seats in the houses, if you will, like the gentry class in the South, kind of took up most of the good land with their superior capital, with their money to play with. The bourgeois leaders, the people of the city, leaders up in the northern colonies who already had money, as well, that they kind of took the best of the resources and took the most political positions, etc. But in the West, Turner says it offered a clean slate. It offered a clean slate for everyone to start on equal footing and to try to make something of him or herself. And the two things that he claims served as kind of levelers, right? Put everyone on an equal playing field, on a level basis, were the dangers as well as the opportunities, right? And you look at the dangers, you look at the history of the Oregon Trail, the California or Mormon Trail, and then the Southern Santa Fe Trail across the country, each of which was about 2,000 miles long. And you find plenty of evidence in diaries and other primary sources for that time period that they ran into plenty of difficulties, right? First and foremost, you have disease, cholera, typhoid fever, dysentery, all kinds of diseases that oftentimes sadly, took children very easily. And so you had to contend with that. And remember, this is before the germ theory of the 1880s. And so the mortality rates were they were higher than they were on the East Coast, arguably, according to some sources. Then you also have accidents. When you look at the main rivers that had to be traversed, the Snake River, because it was like a snake and it changed current and directions rather violently. Many people supposedly drown in the Snake River. The Platte River was seen to have been very deceptive because it looked rather tranquil at the top, but there was a very strong undertow beneath. So when people thought that they could safely pass through the river on horse or on foot, they sometimes were sadly surprised to encounter the undertow and drowned therein. You have the Columbia River, these other rivers, right? You also have historians like a gentleman named Candy, like the candy that you eat, Moulton, Moulton. And Candy Moulton was an old school historian who really kind of adhered to Turner's thesis. And in Moulton's books, you find evidence of specific people, of specifically cowboys on their cattle runs, dying from a myriad of things like buffalo or cattle stampedes, snow avalanches and cave-ins, rock fallings from mountains, just a wide variety of things that could have gone wrong. Snake bites, attacks from bear, mountain lions, etc. And so you find evidence of the dangers in the West therein. Then another one would be the fact that was a bit unique to the West, according to Turner's thesis, is that for a brief period of time in parts of the West, they did not follow the Northwest ordinances that they followed further east. The Northwest ordinances made by Thomas Jefferson and our founding fathers when we tried a confederacy before this republic for a few years after the War for Independence, they had a systematic way by which that they would survey the land, put everything into 6-acre square plots. So many 6-acre square plots would make a city, so many of those would make a county, and so many of those would make a state. And it was decided upon by Congress and had to be approved by Congress. When you got to a certain number of people, for a while there, it got up to about 60,000. When you finally get up to that high of a population, you could have a general election and elect representatives to a state convention, write a state constitution. It could not in any way contradict anything in the federal constitution, and Congress got to decide if they would accept you from a territory status to a state status. But even while you were waiting and in a territorial status, they usually would put, like with the Louisiana Purchase going back to 1803, they would put a hand-picked governor with a hand-picked council beneath them. They would have some form of like a sheriff's posse system or police system that they would try to impose. And also with land, with it surveyed, they would send land survey offices out, and they would put up one section at a time up for auction and for sale, free for the public. And they would publicize it by way of federal propaganda and the newspapers. But in a few places in the West, it didn't happen that way. Like with California, for instance, President Polk decided when, just the timing of everything, right? We took California from Mexico on February 2nd, 1848, where gold was discovered on January 24th, just like 8 days before that in California, before it was formally ours. So instead of following the Northwest Ordinance, Polk decided to just let it open up for the taking. He literally encouraged that bit of chaotic rush to go get the gold. And some people believe he did it out of somewhat imperialistic, like being a bully, taking other people's property, and racist designs to take it from the Latinos, the Hispanics here in the West. But for whatever his reasons were, that's what happened. So people rushed to California when the Mexican government was no longer legally recognized. All we had was our military there. So we had a governor named Mason in charge of the military, but he had no sheriff's posses. He had no police departments. There weren't recognized county and city governments because they were under the Spanish, under the Mexican government just weeks before. And so hence you had a bit of anarchy, of no government. And so in the mines, people engaged in claim jumping, where they'd have more numbers and more weapons on them, and they would just simply bully and push people out of certain mines that they thought might be profitable. and say, sorry, this mine's ours now, and there's nothing you could do about it. Kind of might made right in this span of, it kind of reminds me of that, what is it, the story of the kids that get marooned on an island, and all hell breaks loose. Shame on me for not remembering that book. I read it a couple times, and it's of course not coming to me now. But at any rate, you have that instant. You have that in the Comstock area of silver found in Nevada. You have that in the Dakotas and in Montana, where gold was found as well. And so you had people rely upon vigilantism, where people would get together and say, you know what, we're going to become the law. We're going to collectively form a vigilante group. We're going to try to go through the motions of putting people on trial for certain crimes, stealing and murder and so forth. Lord of the Flies. Thank you so much, Francis Evans. Thank you. It reminds me of Lord of the Flies. That's the name of the book. So at any rate, with this, so that you have an element of that. For instance, there were a couple cities in New Mexico and Kansas, Baxter and Caldwell, whereby they were so terrorized by ruffians who were coming into town and just extorting people, right? Give us this or we're going to shoot you down right here and now, that they actually deputized every citizen in that town and armed them and told them they had the legal right to shoot on spot any cowboy that comes into town to extort anyone else. I mean, to me, that's a pretty telling stat on the contention that there was a brief period of anarchy in some parts of the West. You also look at vigilante groups like the Dalton Gang. The Dalton Gang were a group of outlaws, and they had terrorized several states, especially Kansas. They were chased by family members of those whom they had killed all the way down to the Texas-Mexico border, and engaged in a shootout, killed the Dalton brothers. And if you Google Dalton brothers, the most iconic picture is 3 or 4 of them dead, laying, and they're displaying their bodies as a deterrent, saying this is what's going to happen to outlaws in our area. We, the people, will be sure of it ourselves. And so, so that's part that, so as far as the dangers, right, you could make the argument in favor of Turner's thesis that there were dangers faced by everyone. And then also as for opportunities, right? With opportunities, you see especially entrepreneurial opportunities. I remember an entrepreneur is literally someone who takes a risk in trying to start some type of business. And so, for instance, during the gold rush, some people decided that they had seen the elephant. That was a euphemism, like, okay, the elephant was the climax of the circus, and I've already seen the elephant, so I'm going home. That was a euphemism for, okay, I've seen enough of what the West has to offer. I'm ready to go back home. So for those who had seen the elephant and headed back eastwardly, they offered oftentimes about 75 cents a piece to anyone that they came across, telling them, I will bring mail back to your loved ones for 75 cents a letter. You had people, when they developed spots, key stopping spots and depot areas to come in and have your horseshoes fixed, redevelop something that had gone awry with your Conestoga wagon, get more flour and supplies. The military tried to do that with military forts, but also private people, especially some of the famous mountain men, established forts at key areas. And they made money by offering their services of fixing something for them or some type of commodity, food, what have you, and made money that way. The Mormons, when they made their famous deal with the federal government to be exempted from and protected from persecution from back in Illinois when they faced so much persecution there, they were given a spot in Utah, provided that they provide enough men to fight in the Mexican-American War for the federal army. And doing so, when many of them traveled, they developed a reputation for being very inventive. And one of the simple things they invented were rafts of some sort, or ferries, to ferry across the dangerous rivers. So they began charging people however much a family to ferry them across the Columbia River, the Platte River, the Snake River, etc. And so they made money that way. You had a guy named Sam Brannan, Brannan, and Brannan just simply bought all the pickaxes and shovels and basic the rocking cats to use at the superficial level of mining gold in the California rivers. He bought as many of the rockers and other things as he could, and then sold them at exorbitantly high rates, because for a while there in San Francisco, he was one of the only people who sold mining utensils to miners. And as you may know, the primary sources indicate that people came in such a frenzy during the gold rush that a lot of people did not even bring a single tool with them. Such was their excitement and exuberance at just getting over there and beating others to the mines. And then not to mention, in 1848, when you look at the Alta California and the Spanish newspapers, they made it clear that in 1848, before the famous 49ers came in such large numbers, that the gold was there for the taking at the superficial or placer level, that people were just simply digging it out of the beds of the American Feather, McCulmay, Sacramento rivers, and so Tuolumne, etc. And so if you were here early, you got the good pickings. And the same thing in Montana, Dakotas, and Nevada, all right? And so you had opportunities with mining. And the federal government made sure that that was okay, like with Polk and the gold rush, by declaring subterranean minerals free for the taking, because in other countries in human history, that hadn't been the case. Subterranean minerals were the prerogative of the king or queen, his or her property. And so you had that opportunity. The Chinese were quickly resented for their success in doing something as simple as beginning laundromats of washing miners' clothes, right? They even had the reputation, and there was anger over it, that they would simply, the amount of gold dust found in people's pockets of their pants, they would collect them in vats as they were washing their clothes, and made a separate fortune from that gold dust, as well as charging them to wash their clothes. Of course, the famous Levi with his jeans, his pants, etc. People boarded. They bought a cheap property and built 3-4 story buildings and boarded as many people as possible as a hotel for people to stay in, and provided room and board and breakfast, etc. And were able to charge people for that. Along the railroads, when the railroads developed depots, people would come and oftentimes become nouveau riche, suddenly get a lot of money in cash for bringing in cattle. And that was another big money maker, is Rutherford B. Hayes and other presidents of the United States declared cattle free for the taking, as long as it had not been branded. So in southern Texas, a large wild population of cattle, especially the famous Texas Longhorn, existed from the days of Coronado in the 1540s. And they had proliferated in number, obviously, throughout those 3 centuries. And so they could come and take the cattle up the Chisholm Trail. A guy named George G. McCoy was real big in establishing connections to the Kansas railroads, but that still oftentimes could be up to a 1,000-mile march. So it was tough for the cowboy to come in, but there was money to be made. You can come down, bring cattle, and lead them to the nearest train depot up into Kansas or over to California, or up further up north, up into Wisconsin, Montana, or the Dakotas. At one time in 1872, one steer could be sold for $75. And that's back then, which was much more money back then. So this was a big money maker. But at the same time, while you were there, especially when you went through arroyos, right, where the depths of canyons where you're most vulnerable, you would sometimes have people waiting to, quote, get the drop on you, and to put a gun on you and have superior numbers and weapons and say, hand over the cattle or else we kill you on the spot. So it all leads to Turner's thesis, right? that the West was very, it was indiscriminately dangerous, but he almost applies, I don't think it's too far of a stretch to imply that he applied even a little bit of social Darwinian theory, of kind of survival of the fittest, that it didn't matter how rich you were in the West, what your last name was, where you were from, that you faced these same dangers and you were afforded these same opportunities. And then, of course, in 1862, you had the famous Homestead Act, and you were granted 160 acres of free land, namely in Kansas and Nebraska, from the federal government, as long as you vowed loyalty to the Union, because they're in the midst of the Civil War from 61 to 65, right? And so that you won't aid the Confederacy, and that you will promote education, and that they develop schools as well. So many of the recipients of these 160-acre plots were actual immigrants, many Central and Eastern Europeans, Hungarians, Czechs, Russians, etc., who came in and received 160 acres of free land. So you see, there is evidence that you could look to suggest that Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis has some merit to it. Okay. Are there any questions so far or any comments? Yes. Yes, like I said, hence the Darwinian side, right? Is that and that your question kind of transitions us into the second thesis, right? Is the rich people when they came in, they were able to buy expensive machinery that the poor could not buy. So you had a process, right? Goodness, let's see here, my source here. Where is that darn book? Right here. This is known as the Bonanza King by Gregory Crouch. And in this book, right, a gentleman who had a lot of money was able to invent the Washoe Pan process, WASHOE, and then Pan, PAN process. I'm on page 109 of his book. That was the use of steam engines and these pounding machines that could go hundreds and even thousands of feet underground to extract the coal and extract other minerals. A poor person could not afford that, right? Also, the pneumatic, PNEUMATIC, air-powered, or hydraulic, water-powered, HYDRAULIC, with these hydraulic and pneumatic drills and the Washoe Pan process. No problem. The rich had a big leg up. So after 1848, for instance, right, the 49ers, they came over 80,000 came across and registered coming across the Oregon Trail itself in 1849. And it's pretty simple to suggest, right, that when you only have a finite amount of gold and you have tens and even hundreds of thousands of people coming, eventually they're going to exhaust how much gold, all the gold that's available. But according to Alan Brinkley in our textbook, the majority of wealth was extracted from deeper in the mines, much deeper than a human being with a mere pickaxe could ever get to. So the majority of wealth that was extracted came by way of heavy machinery that the average person could not afford. The average people, the best they can do was pull their resources together, 20 to 30 of them, to engage in the famous the long toms, as they were called, right? Where they would have these troughs and they would try to divert the river current away and have the river current push forward and have the sediment brought with it. And they would have cleats along these long wooden troughs, and they would use gravity to push the water and the sediment downward. And the cleats at the bottom of the trough would catch the heavy stuff, and the water and the light stuff would go back down into the river. And then they would have to go back and find within the cleats if they could extract anything worthwhile as far as gold. And the Spanish from Chile, especially the Chileans, they knew how to use mercury to extract the real stuff from the fake stuff. And it took a while for everyone else to catch hold of that. So people were limited and even pulling their resources together as far as what kind of success they could have. But when you go to like this gentleman here with a washoe panning process that literally pounded into the earth, thousands of feet in a single day. When you had the pneumatic and hydraulic drills, those were thousands and thousands of dollars that the average people, even when they pulled resources together, could not afford. So it was the corporations, it was the rich corporations that could afford to do that, right? And then not to mention the railroads. There's only a finite number of cattle that could be rustled and brought to a train depot. And the train depots continued to extend their lines all the way down into Texas. So there was no longer a need for that cattle run, right? Why do you need to bring up the Chisholm Trail from southern Texas all the way to Kansas when you have a railroad coming from Kansas all the way down into Texas itself? So when there's no longer a need for that run, that the cattle drive is no longer significant or necessary for the cowboy. So the cowboys end up working, getting paid by the hour or by the day, rather than being paid $75 for each head of cattle, right? Because now the rich guys are buying up all the cattle and they're making these business transactions with the railroads that are coming all the way to their ranches. And so the cattleman, the cowboy, ended up becoming a mere ranch hand for these wealthy ranchers and did not get paid very well at all, doing the basic work of handling and breaking in horses and feeding the cattle, etc., and getting them prepared for removal along the trains. And then the cattle cars, right? Refrigerated cattle cars came about through a guy named Gustavus Swift. He was kind of a rags to riches guy who invented the refrigerated box car. But once he did it, only wealthy people could afford to invest in these refrigerated box cars, right? And then as they were brought, many of them were slaughtered in Chicago. And it was the wealthiest who bought the majority of cattle. They could outbid everyone else. The wealthy outbid everyone else. And so you had just 3 or 4 major cattle slaughter companies in Chicago that were buying and bringing in and slaughtering most of the cattle and selling them for food to the further East Coast, to New York, Boston, Philadelphia, etc. So with number 2, right, I'm taking a 180 and it's more Marxist history and saying, well, when you scratch the surface, I don't know if I buy this equality of opportunity thesis. That it seems to me like in the West, like everywhere else, it takes money to make money, and the wealthy have a large advantage over the less wealthy. And then lastly, with it, as an examples of that in industry, is farming, right? Again, as they began to parcel out and see, you have something known as squatters' rights, right? And that comes back all the way to English common law. And the idea is if you move upon land that's not contested and is not inhabited, but technically it's owned by someone, right? It's either claimed by the federal government, a state or local government, or it's owned by a rich guy who's waiting to sell it for profit and lives elsewhere. But if you go upon the land and you improve it, you cultivate it and make it more profitable, right? From the time, especially in your 101 class of Andrew Jackson's time period, it was a way of buying poor, ambitious white men's votes by having the judges grant them that right to that land as squatters, saying, you know what, you improved it. And so what they could do a myriad of things. They could mandate under eminent domain, right? That private property needs to switch hands for the betterment of the community. The judge could claim eminent domain and make the owner of that land sell that land to the squatter at market price. They could have the squatter have the right to be the first to buy it if it's open, if it's going to be open to sell anyway, if it belongs to the government and not a private person, and they're about to put it on sale anyway. They could give first dibs to buy that land to that squatter, but there were ways of doing that. Some people call that kind of a safety valve thesis, that the poor, ambitious white men, if they're ambitious enough to go on land that's not theirs and farm it and try to make money off it and sell it as a cash crop, then likely if they become too disgruntled, they might rebel in one form or another. So better to make them happy and give them some type of access to it. But the thing is, the squatters never squat on that much territory. One man could only cultivate so much land, right? So you had opportunities for squatting, but that was nothing compared to when they opened up the Northwest Ordinance rules eventually in the West as well. And they put it up into square 6-acre square plots, and they sold it to the highest bidders in some places. The rich could outbid everyone else, especially land speculators, right? That's like flipping houses. That's like someone who's wealthy in the East Coast. He never even plans to move to Wyoming. He just knows, he hears that Wyoming, or assumes that Wyoming is going to develop rather soon. So he knows, right, like here, somewhere around here, just agrarian area, and it's cheap. And you get inside information that they're going to develop a shopping mall or a Walmart or something. So you want to buy that land now and wait for the value of it to skyrocket when it's to be developed, and then sell it for profit. That's what the land speculators did. So the land speculators could outbid the poor squatters and others. And so they bought the lion's share of the land. And then not to mention, they had money for the new machinery. Cyrus McCormick, later John Deere, they put together machinery, right? The mechanical reaper, the mechanical thresher, the harvester combine. And these machines can do, Howard Zinn says this in his book, they can do in 3.5 hours what would take a farmer over 2 weeks to do. Okay. And so, yeah, people would say that capitalism is inherently unfair, that it's inherently inequitable, that yes, technically there are opportunities for the common man. There is a free market for him to compete in. But when you look at the reality of things, of how things really are, right, de facto, that the wealthy just have an absolute unfair advantage. That it's just like an NFL football team playing against a high school football team. And it's just, there's no way that the little guy has any chance of winning. So that's why today's liberals, right, especially when we get to FDR and the New Deal, the Democrats and the Liberal Party is going to kind of flop and say that there needs to be bigger government in the economy to give the little guys a chance, a better fighting chance. That capitalism, as far as laissez-faire capitalism, the government just letting it be, is too Darwinian. It's too cutthroat, so that the guys with money, it's just unfair. They're inevitably going to win. And real opportunity doesn't exist for the smaller guys. And then another case in point, lastly, are the railroads. From the time of Alexander Hamilton, if you can convince, and this goes all the way through the 1990s, you guys, here in the Silicon Valley in San Jose, with microchip and computer technology. If you could convince the government that your industry that you're in is vital for the whole country's economy and for the whole country's well-being, the government will subsidize you. They will grant you grants of free money or loans at no or very small interest. They'll grant you bond certificates so that you get money off the bond certificates as if you've lent money to the government, but you really didn't, but you're getting that fictitious money and interest paid to you. You can get tax breaks. You can get protective taxes or tariffs on imported competitors against you, where the government artificially raises their prices to help you out and your product to be cheaper. You could be subsidized. And the railroads are a case in point. The railroads received over 200 million acres of free land because they convinced the government that their venture was too expensive to do on their own, and that their venture would benefit the entire country of connecting region to region by railroad tracks. And so the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific created the Transcontinental Railroad from Nebraska to California. They each received a lot, millions and millions of acres of free land, where they would tell them, okay, for every mile of track that you lay, because that's got to be very expensive with all the iron and steel, all the laborers that you're employing, right? Having to feed the people and engage and take on the ecosystem, maybe even fight off Native American attacks. So we're going to make it worth your while. For every mile of track you lay, we'll give you 14 square miles of land around that track to you, the railroad, to sell for your own profit. And then if it is considered mountainous, and so that you might have to use nitroglycerin or dynamite to blow through mountains, and that's going to become much more difficult and expensive, we'll give you 21 square miles or acres for every mile that you lay, right? And so what the railroads were doing is they were bribing the land surveyors representing the government and getting the optimal 21, saying that it was mountainous, oftentimes when it was not mountainous. And in the one case, the Union Pacific claimed that they needed money to blast through a mountain and do a bridge, and they ended up going a shorter, easier route, but they had already received the money to make that bridge and so forth. They lied about it, claimed that they blasted through the mountain and built the bridge, made up their own fictitious construction company, paid themselves that money, and tried to hush it. And then when a reporter got onto it, they tried to bribe congressmen into just shooing it away. And that was a Union Pacific's credit mobilier scandal in the 1870s. So the railroads became hated. There was a place called Muscle Slough down in Southern California, and there were a handful of squatters who were there and had worked their bottoms off farming that land and cultivating it, and a local judge granted it to them, claiming that no Native American tribe or Hispanic previous owner was claiming that land, so that it was theirs. Then suddenly the Kansas Pacific Railroad comes in, or the Kansas Topeka, and said, all right, move guys, we've been given this land for our railroad and all the land around it by the federal government. And they said, no, wait a minute, a local judge said it's ours. They said, well, he's just a local judge. We have federal Congress granting it to us, and Congress trumps a local judge's power. And so they refused to leave. So they sent a deputy and a sheriff to remove them, and they shot one of the two, the squatters did. And so then the Kansas Topeka got Congress to send over a regiment of troops from an Arizona fort all the way up into Southern California to fight and kill if necessary and kick these people off of Muscle Slough, these squatters. And so as a case in point, right, for revisionist history, for revising the romantic court history and Turner thesis, that, you know what, people with money had a huge leg up. All right. So any questions or comments so far? All right. And then lastly, right, you have post-civil rights history, whereby they show the manner by which certain minority groups were dealt with unfairly and did not receive equality of opportunity regarding their pursuit of the American dream. So with the Hispanics, right, you see that they had lost their land and it had been taken from them in the Mexican-American War that ended in February of 1848. But the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had promised them on paper citizenship rights and entitlement to their property. But many of them, in the midst of that, they still ended up losing their property. People claimed that they did not, judges decided that they couldn't sufficiently claim all of their property because they wanted longitude and latitude lines. The governing authority's signature, our requirements for proof of ownership were pretty high, and not all the Hispanics could, I'm sorry, just wondering who won the war. So the Mexican-American War, right? The Americans won the war. So they took New Mexico, Arizona, California, parts of Colorado and Utah, all from Mexico. A young Abraham Lincoln, a young Ulysses Grant spoke out against how unfair and immoral the war was. You could make the argument that President Polk and his administration picked a fight so they could take this coveted land from Mexico. But it's part of the tension that we see, a negative legacy of this to this day, Anglo and Latino tension. But it was taken from Mexico in 1848 in the Mexican-American War under President James K. Polk. Okay, no problem. And so now that it belongs to the U.S., the common saying is, right, is the Mexicans didn't cross the border crossed them, because this was Mexico over here at that time until the end of the war. So they were guaranteed on paper all the full rights of citizenship, but it didn't end up that way. And you look at Chicano historians, Felipe Fernandez, Armesto, is a good author on this. And other Chicano historians give a lot of the dirt as far as the injustices that Latinos experienced here in the West at the end of this war. A lot of them were kicked out of the mines, Americans claiming that California was theirs now, and that the quote Mexicans shouldn't be taking the wealth out of the mines. And so you had drama during the gold rush. And like I said, afterward in the courts, there were a lot of fighting in the courts. A very powerful Mexican man, and later Mexican-American, because he stayed here, was Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, that Vallejo's named after. And look into his story. It's a very sad biography. He lost a lot of his lands here in California, etc. So at any rate, Mexican-Americans clearly were discriminated against. By the end of the 1800s, you're already going to experience something that the Mexican-American community calls proletarianization. Remember, the proletariat is is Marxist term for the industrial working class who work with their hands, right? And so proletarianization means that the Latino people were pigeonholed into the proletariat, and they could almost never go any higher than that they were going to inevitably become farm workers, factory workers, etc., right? Working with their hands, not having many opportunities to rise up the socioeconomic scale. And you always had some exceptions. You have San Antonio, Texas, Los Angeles, California, Tucson, Arizona, and parts of New Mexico, where you had kind of an intelligentsia, a group of Latinos who were college educated, who were lawyers, newspaper writers, teachers, etc. But those were the exceptions rather than the rule. You had some families in New Mexico, the Armijo family, Armijo, and who did very well and were able to collaborate with or compete with, in different instances, Anglo corporate competitors, and becoming very adept as businessmen. But again, it seemed like they were more the exception than they were the rule. And so with proletarianization, how did Latinos respond to that? Well, for one, is they held on to their culture very well. That you might be able to pigeonhole us. And when I say pigeonhole, I mean that they technically, like physically, are kind of kept in those jobs, and there's not much of an actual chance to advance beyond them. They use the term glass ceiling, right? You can't really see it because there's not an actual law that says that a Latino can't become a foreman or rise up to be a white-collar worker at a factory or on a farm. They just never did it, right? But also they are stigmatized, right? And stigmatized is saying that, oh, that's where they belong. So when I say stigmatized, I think of, imagine if you, to make a little light of this heavy subject, imagine if I said that Will Ferrell is going to do a serious action movie or a serious romance movie. And some of you, including myself, might kind of chuckle, right? Because you think, Will Ferrell, no, that guy's a funny man. He's a comedian. He needs to stick what he's good at to what he's good at, right? And so Mexican Americans were pigeonholed in that they said that's where they belong. that they're not as intelligent, they won't do well in school, even if you let them go to college, and that they're good with their hands and they're hard workers, and they belong where they are working in manual labor jobs. So, so in response to that, some of them, most of them, clung very tenaciously to their culture. There have been studies with, for instance, mestizaje, right? Interethnic sex and marriage and procreation with children, that a lot of marriages with a Latino husband or a Latina wife and an Anglo husband or wife with them, that oftentimes they raise their kids as Latinos. Nominally, most of the time, Roman Catholic and with Mexican American heritage, etc. So that's one way that they responded. Some responded by fighting within the system. Like I mentioned, in New Mexico, with the Armijos and other families, they fought very well economically and did well for themselves, right? You also had within, some of them fought outside the system, and they engaged in brigandage. And brigandage, right, is when you kind of become like you liken yourself to a Robin Hood, and you fight against the big, wealthy Anglo Texas cattle ranchers and others. You go and cut their barbed wire and let their cattle get out. And then you use that money by selling their cattle, and you give it to the gente, to the Mexican American people. You had people who played that type of Robin Hood role in the late 1800s in the Southwest. Okay, Gregorio Cortez being one of them, and so at any rate, some fought within the system, some fought outside the system. Some of them unionized. The Anaconda Copper Company usually employed only Mexican American laborers, but they paid them very low wages and didn't treat them very well. And so they engaged in strikes and boycotts, and they fought for their rights, and sometimes were successful and sometimes they were not. But those were ways in which they tried to respond to being kind of pigeonholed into the proletariat. And then, of course, with the Asian Americans, right? The Asians, right? One thing that I find interesting is the irony that a good reputation oftentimes was cited in the midst of discriminatory legislation. If you read the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, it actually brags on the Chinese immigrants, saying that they are industrious, diligent, that they work hard, they work quickly, they save their earnings and don't squander their money, and they're doing too well, and hence they're taking jobs from white men. And so I find that very kind of ironically sad that with Asian immigrants from the get-go, they were discriminated against, at least partly because of their perceived success. And there was envy and jealousy that white Americans were going to lose their jobs to them. In the fruit companies, the Japanese and Chinese started doing very well, pulling their resources together and buying their own farms and engaging in apple and other fruit cultivation and selling it for profit. California responded by enacting 2 Alien Land Acts, saying that if you are an alien, an immigrant, you cannot purchase land. And so very discriminatory measures against East Asians in this country, largely tied to their success. And then needless to say, they were highly exploited on the Transcontinental Railroad. Charles Crocker of the Central Pacific, starting here in California in Sacramento, he made a bet that his Chinese laborers could lay a mile of track in a day. No, that's a good question. Thank goodness we do not have those laws. Those laws have been abrogated. They've been done away with. Thank God. That would be awful. But yeah, those laws are no longer in effect. Thank God. But they lasted, sadly, for a long time. So at any rate, with the Chinese immigrants, right? He made a bet with William Durant of the Union Pacific, and he won. Supposedly they laid like 2.5 miles of track in a single day. And from that bet, they began bringing thousands of, they believe over 100,000 Chinese immigrants in to work for the Central Pacific Railroad, because they developed the reputation once again as being very hardworking, very, very quick and efficient at what they did. And also, sadly, because they gained a reputation for docility. If you're docile, D-O-C-I-L-E, docile means you're very meek and humble, and you do as you're told, and you won't rebel. You'll take whatever crappy circumstances are given you without complaining. And so they were the ideal exploitable labor source, right, to take advantage of. So the Central Pacific did. There were over 1,000 deaths, about 1,200 working on the railroad. Snow avalanches, cave-ins, explosions, exhaustion, dehydration, a myriad of things brought about those deaths with the Chinese laborers on the Central Pacific. They were seen to have a diminutive size, a smaller and lighter body frame. And so they were put deep into the crevices of the mines. Sometimes they would hang them from the sides of mountains in these tool reed baskets to put in dynamite sticks and hope that they would be pulled up. Their basket would be pulled up by the time they lit it and by the time it would explode, so that they wouldn't die in the explosion. Very much put in the most dangerous work detail possible. There is a book, let's see here, it is, trying to find my my Western history books here. Give me just one moment. Shoot, where are you? Strangers from a Different Shore. This is a great book by Ronald Takaki, The Plight of Asian Immigrants coming into the West and how they were treated, etc. It gives a lot of detail to that. So you have that phenomenon with the Asian Americans. And then, of course, lastly, the Native Americans, right? And with the Native Americans, it was a culmination of many things that led to war. For one, right, is when people began crossing the overland trails, the federal government forced treaties upon the Plains Native tribes, saying that you are going to allow safe passage of Americans to go through your territory. And in return, we promise you annuities. We promise you yearly supplies of food and drink. It was like lots of flour and bread and coffee and tobacco and some money, etc., right? For exchange, because they knew that the Americans would make messes when they went through their territory, would kill some of their bison, their buffalo, etc. And so from the very get-go, not all of the legitimate leaders of the tribes agreed to this and showed up to sign the treaties. So then there developed the phenomenon of treaty chiefs with quotation marks. A treaty chief is someone who is not really the legitimate chief of the tribe, but someone who was willing to take the deal. And oftentimes it involves some type of bribery from the federal government. So now, right, with some of these tribes, they're immediately angry, not only about Anglo-Americans coming through their territory and they could do nothing about it, but now they are told they have to stay within certain parameters. The Platte River was a big river for the northern plains, for them to stay above or below. Below were like the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Kiowa and Crow. Above were the Blackfeet and the Sioux. And they were supposed to stay in their respective regions. And the Native Americans resented that because this had been their land for centuries, right? And they'd always been free to roam as they pleased and interact with one another amongst other tribes as far as where they could and could not go. Secondly, they're angry because not all of the legitimate leaders okayed this. And so if you have someone who is a low social standing in your tribe, and he's the one who signed the treaty, you won't recognize that treaty, right? Because who is he to have made that decision on behalf of the tribe? And in some cases, they actually killed the Native Americans, sometimes killed those who were willing to, quote, touch the white man's pen on their behalf. Then you also had, right, the problem with the Sioux, Arapaho, and Cheyenne. They teamed up as a triumvirate and they defeated the Crow, and the Kiowa, and some of the other Great Plains native tribes, and they began expanding their territory. And the Sioux very shrewdly wrote back to the federal government and said, hey, you for centuries have declared land by conquest. You just did it from Mexico. You've done it before that with many other Native American tribes, etc. We're doing the same thing you are. So now all of the plains belong to us. So then there was an outcry in the US on the East Coast saying the Sioux are bullies, are imperialist bullies. Never mind the fact that they were doing exactly what the federal government did, right? But they started developing a kind of a negative stigma or image on the East Coast, the Sioux, that is, right? Sioux. And when I say Sioux, the Lakota, the Dakota, those are all variations of the same tribe together. So at any rate, you have that episode, right? So then you have the problem of drama with people passing through. And of course, that seems like that was going to be inevitable, where some of the Anglo miners coming in shot at some of the cattle or the bison that the Native Americans claimed, and the Native Americans retaliated. So you had reports in the press, and the press really whipped this up, that, quote, Indians are killing settlers crossing their territories. So then another string of treaties were forced upon the Native Americans. The most famous were Fort Laramie, Laramie, Medicine Lodge. Another one was, Fort Laramie, Medicine Lodge. Those are the big ones, actually, but there were a couple others. If you'll give me a moment to try to find that, or maybe I'll come back to it. And by the way, on this topic, I would recommend Richard White. This particular book, it's called It's Your Misfortune and None of My Own. This is just one of several books he does a really good, thorough job on drama between the federal government and the state governments, for that matter, and the Native American tribes. So you have Medicine Lodge Treaty, Fort Laramie Treaty, right? Whereby there's the federal government says, in the name of the protection of our citizens, we're bringing in strings of forts to protect them. The most hated one was called the Bozeman Trail, Bozeman, along the north of the plains. So they start bringing in these strings of forts, and again, a lot of the actual leaders of these tribes refused to sign it, but others did, and they signed it nevertheless, right? And so you had drama up on the top of the Bozeman Trail with a guy named Red Cloud. Red Cloud of the Brule Sioux began attacking the soldiers, and then he went on a speaking tour throughout the East Coast, saying how the Sioux had every right to fire upon the soldiers, that their actual legitimate leaders had never given consent for people to pass through their territory, much less for soldiers who are armed with bad intentions to build forts in their territory as well. And he tried to whip up popular sympathy for the plight of the Sioux. And from what I read, it was pretty mixed. He did elicit some sympathy, but not enough to determine public policy. And the federal government is going to continue to stay kind of hard-nosed. Another episode of drama is the states. Washington State, Oregon State, and Texas State. There were federal treaties that granted rights to the land in their states to the Native Americans. So I say federal, right? The Congress, right? And the state governors and legislators said, no, we don't recognize those treaties. And they engaged in attempts, kind of like the Trail of Tears in your 101 class with the Cherokee. They tried to use eminent domain and force the natives to sell their land to the state. When the natives refused, war broke out in all three of those states, and the federal government did nothing about it. And then another source of friction is now from the time of the 1860s, about the time of the Civil War, there was a well-meaning movement by missionaries, Christian missionaries and others, who saw kind of the writing on the wall that Native Americans were going to eventually possibly get wiped out by our imperialistic government and by our greedy population moving into their territory. And they said, for their own safety, we need to put them on reservations. So that idea of reservations really took hold, right? And so in those treaties that I mentioned, where they had to okay Fort Laramie, Medicine Lodge, they dictated in those treaties not only that military forts can come by to protect American citizens, but that in certain times of the year, the natives had to report to their respective reservation. And of course, a lot of the young of the Sioux said, no way, they're not abiding by this. And so that's going to cause the ultimate showdown here pretty soon. But for now, note that with when they were put on these reservations, very quickly the reservations developed a reputation for poor treatment of the Native Americans. A lot of the people in charge were military personnel, and they were rough with them, and there was a lot of corruption. A common thing to do was to get in the supplies for the natives and to sell it for profit, to enrich yourself, and lie on a report and say the shipment never came, and wait for the next shipment to come in to give to the Native Americans. Something that simple and devious happened quite often on the reservations. And it literally caused an uprising in Minnesota amongst the Sioux's ally in Minnesota, when twice in a row their shipments did not come in and they were starving on the reservation. And then so some went off the reservation to go hunt, and they were hunted down for disobeying the federal government, even though they were starving. Well, it was less black and white than that. When they went out on their hunt, they killed a handful of white settlers in anger. And so it's just those types of things happen, right? But, and then ultimately you have a person put in charge of the military, and his name is Philip Sheridan, Sheridan. And I find it very curious that the president at this time was Ulysses Grant, the same guy who fought against the KKK and fought to free the slaves for the Union during the Civil War. Now he is this war hero president. He tried to put in well-respected religious, a lot of Quakers actually, religious folk in charge of the reservations who he thought would better treat the Native Americans. But yet he gave, seemingly, he gave the latitude to Philip Sheridan, in charge of the military in the West, to do this. As Philip Sheridan claimed that anyone who did not abide by his treaty, by the treaty of his tribe, that would not stick to the reservation when that treaty said they were to be on their reservation, was to be shot on sight as a hostile, as someone literally an enemy in war. And so the Sioux, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho, they, when this news came out, it infuriated them. They not only refused those who already had refused to go to the reservations, this especially got them to refuse to do so, but they enlisted some more people to leave the reservations with them. And they roamed and they hunted, and they said, let the federal government come to us. And that's when we brought in two guys that failed. One guy's name was Grattan, Grattan. He boasted that with 100 men, he could wipe out the Sioux. And very sadly, ironically, with about 102 men, he and his men were slaughtered. And then came George Armstrong Custer. And Custer separated his men into 4 different groups. He was guilty, a lot of the narrative says, of hubris, of that type of arrogance that he didn't think natural laws applied to him. And he left behind his large ordnance of cannon, etc., because he thought it was just going to be an easy fight. And he went to the place known as Little Bighorn in Montana, and he and his men were wiped out in minutes. And then the press gets a hold of it and say, oh, the Sioux, they're bloodthirsty and violent. They killed and scalped Custer and his men. They're scoffing at our federal armed forces. Something needs to be done. And by then, a virtual war was declared on those 3 tribes. And then no sooner did they defeat the Sioux and the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. The Sioux leaders were Sitting Bull, was their elderly medicine man leader, and their lead fighter was Crazy Horse. And so they were defeated and either put onto reservations or killed, or actually both. I think both of them. I think Crazy Horse was captured, put on a reservation, and shot in the back and killed. They said he was trying to run away from the reservation, and they don't believe that. And then shortly after that, the Comanche, the Navajo, and the Apache began raids on settlements in the southeast with Geronimo and the Cochise and the Chiricahua Apache. And we declared a brutal war against them as well. And we came in and burnt all their crops. We tried to starve them into submission and offered Geronimo a ceasefire agreement that he finally accepted. So at any rate, are there any questions? Any questions at all? Any comments on any of this pertaining to the West? So 23 on the test, I ask you what Turner's thesis is. 24, evidence to support it. 25, Marxist history challenging it, big money, right? 26, Muscle Slough incident. Remember the squatters getting kicked out by the federal government and representing the Kansas Topeka Railroad. Hispanics in the West, we went over that. Let's see here. Hispanic or Latino responses to their plight of being put into the proletariat, number 28. The Chinese and how they were treated, 29. 30, the railroads. 31, sources of fighting between Native Americans and the federal government, which we just covered. 32, the Sioux. All right, and then just one more, if you don't mind, and we're done. Number 33, women. I would make the argument. Can you please give me some? Absolutely. Miss Buenrostro, that's fine. After the meeting. Let's see here. With women, women were given the rights of citizenship first in it was Montana or Wyoming in the West. Women began earning rights to property in the West. They began winning custody rights first in the West. They became a large percentage of property owners, especially with their inns, their hotels that they kept, right? Businesses in the West. And the rowdy cow towns and the mining towns, right? But the argument that I make subjectively from what I've read, and you could take this with a grain of salt, is it was not because the demographic that moved to the West was more progressive by any sense, that they were more egalitarian, that they thought everyone should be on equal footing, and that on principle they thought women should have more rights. To me, it just happened organically. A lot of women were abandoned by their husbands in the West, so they started winning case-by-case rights to claim their property, to have custody over their children, to be able to start a business, to feed their children, etc., right? Matter of fact, in some of the first states where women were given the right to vote, it has become clear in the primary sources from confessions of some of the politicians in the West that they did it simply because they needed to count women to become a state. Remember I said oftentimes 60,000 was the magic number that Congress oftentimes demanded. Until your territory could boast 60,000 inhabitants, you couldn't apply for statehood. And certain privileges and opportunities come with statehood as opposed to being a mere territory. And so some of them knew they could only count to 60,000 if they counted the women. So to me, I don't think the West deserves or earns the sobriquet of being more democratic, more egalitarian, more progressive, forward-looking, and giving more women more opportunities and powers in the West. I think it just happened that way. It grew organically by the circumstances. All right. And you feel free to disagree with me on that, and I'll try to qualify it on the test. Okay. But that's just me. That's what I think for number 33, 32 or 33. All right. And then numbers 34 and 35 we'll get from the book. Okay. Chapter 16, labor in the West. I'll ask a question from there. And then chapter 16 also for number 35, romance of the West. So I'll ask questions straight from those sections. Okay, so be sure to study those. And so there'll be 35 questions, and I will give you the last 15 as your curve to make it out of an even 50, because each test is worth 50. All right, so whatever your raw score is out of 35, because I believe it will tell you immediately as I'll mark what I intend to be my correct answers. Be sure to add 15 to it. And know that that's what your score is out of 50. Okay. So I had a student ask me for a little one-on-one time to answer a couple questions. You can feel free to do the same, but otherwise that's it with our session, you guys. You guys have a good week. Be sure you do the argumentative and the textbook quiz, all right? And next week, textbook quiz and the test. You guys are doing great. Hang in there, okay? So Eurythia, are you there, hon? How can I help you, hon? It's up to you. I believe it's just the two of us now. So you could either type your question or comment, or if you want to unmute yourself and speak to me, either one. I'm okay with either one, okay? No problem. No problem, honey. A thesis, right, is the main argument. It's the main point that the section is trying to make. And everything else in that section is supposed to revolve around that one main point. That's your thesis. That's your thesis statement. Okay? So when I mentioned each of those sections, I talked about the first one, right? Turner's thesis and how there's evidence to support it. Then on number one, that would be the thesis, right? Is that Turner's thesis has merit to it. Turner's thesis is a respectable thesis, right? Because I'm supporting it. And then I would say that the thesis statement for number two is that Turner's thesis is not correct. It disregards the truth that big money always won out, right? That might be considered the thesis to number two, all right? And then with number three, likewise, the thesis might be considered, Turner's thesis does not take into account discrimination faced by Hispanic and Asian Americans in the West. So I would consider that the thesis to number three.
Hello?
Hello. Hi.
Can you hear me?
I can now. Hi.
Hi. Okay. So like I was telling you, you have been giving me suggestions how to get better in my assignments,
Sure.
and I didn't know what a thesis was. So I was wondering, what was it?
Okay, so a thesis is the main argument of the section. That when you read a section, what seems to be the main argument that's being made? Because there should be one kind of general message that the whole section revolves around, right?
Yes.
And so that's what the thesis is, honey.
Oh, okay. So basically, like today's assignment, the Sunday's assignment is about how America got take some part of Mexico, right?
Yes.
So that's basically the main thesis.
No, hun, it's not. What I would say, right, is like number one states that it revolves around Turner's thesis. And remember, Turner's thesis is that there were dangers and opportunities for everyone alike. And so whoever was smart, lucky, tough enough could make a good living in the West. That's Turner's thesis, okay? So number one, I'm supporting that thesis, saying that there were dangers for everybody in the West and that there were opportunities for everyone in the West if they took them.
Wi-Fi. That's the Wi-Fi name you're having.
Okay? And,
Yes.
And number two, and then the rest of them are against Turner's thesis, right? Number two says against it, yes. So number two says, no, I don't believe Turner's thesis is true, that there were equal opportunities for everyone, but that the wealthy, right, los ricos, they had a chance, they had power over everybody else. They had opportunities, better opportunities than everyone else. Okay?
So there wasn't any opportunities back then? Or there was?
Yes, there were opportunities, but more opportunities for the wealthy, for the rich.
Oh, okay.
That's number two, okay?
Number two. Okay.
And then number three is what you were mentioning, is number three says there were not the same opportunities for Latinos or Asian Americans in the West. That's number three. That Turner's thesis is wrong, that there were not equal opportunities for everybody because there was discrimination against Latinos and Asian Americans.
Oh, wait. Cancel. You have read my other assignments, right?
I believe so, yeah. I've done 2 assignments.
Were they wrong? Or what do you think I have to improve?
I don't know, hon. I'd have to look at it again. But whatever it was, I wrote I wrote my response to you. So go ahead and go back to them and look at what I wrote.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
I saw that you were recording this meeting. Can you send the video to me just to so I can remember what I have to talk about?
Yes, I'll try to figure out how to do that. Okay, hon. I'm gonna put it regularly on Canvas, and let me see if I could figure out how to send it just to you. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much.
If I could figure it out, I'll be happy to do that.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
You too. You're 8 set.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye bye.